Hey there, everyone. Welcome back. Today, I want to share a little something different with you. What I've got is about an 8-minute clip where I'm talking about Venus retrograde. So you may or may not know yet that we are going to have a Venus retrograde in the sign of Leo in the middle part of 2023. So it's an important astrological event for this year. In the latter part of last year, I was doing a group mentoring training with some senior students and newer practitioners. And so the clip that you're going to see shortly is an extract from that longer training where I'm talking specifically about all the nuances and all the kind of tips and timing points you need to know about Venus retrograde in Leo in 2023. So what you'll hear me talk about is some of the unique features of Venus retrograde, a little about why it's so important. I've touched very briefly on some of the philosophical significance of Venus retrograde. And of course, I share lots of info about the dates and details in terms of the degrees and when where in Leo the retrograde is happening and when it's happening in terms of the calendar year. I share a couple of diagrams to help you understand more about Venus retrograde as a whole. So this 8-minute training on Venus retrograde, it's like a mini masterclass, if you like, where I'm going to introduce you to the technical components of Venus retrograde and also share some tips on interpretation. Keep in mind, this was shared with a senior group of students, and so it does take a little bit more of that advanced or practical approach, how you might share this information with clients. But if you're curious to know more about how Venus retrograde works, definitely let me know in the comments below. If your question isn't answered in the video that is to follow this intro, I'll try to get to those questions or comments in a future video. So sit back, relax, maybe grab a notepad and pen if you like to jot things down as you listen. And I hope you enjoy this mini Venus retrograde masterclass. All right, till next time, bye. Venus retrograde is a really interesting one because Venus is retrograde the least amount of time of our planets. She spends only about 6 weeks retrograde, and that's every 19 months. Venus will be retrograde for about 6 weeks. And that's about 40 days. And there is lots of symbolism, both in myth and philosophy, and even has been embedded into early Christianity, the Bible and things like that, around these 40-day periods, these 40-day retreats, or these 40 days, doing different things. And, a well-known kind of Christian example is the idea that Jesus spent 40 days in the desert. And this idea of the wandering for the 40 days or the retreat or the reflection for 40 days is really thought to be inspired by the Venus retrograde pattern. We will have Venus retrograde in 2023. So this is a little bit of a heads up for those of you who are doing year ahead sessions and thinking about what are going to be some of the astrological signatures for next year. Venus will retrograde in Leo in 2023. The retrograde starts at 28 Leo and Venus will come all the way back to 12 Leo. So if you've got a big Leo chart, or you've got charts where there's lots of planets in Venus rulership, so lots of planets in Taurus or Libra, of course this Venus retrograde becomes more relevant. The Venus retrograde in 2023 will start on July 22nd and run all the way back to September 3. So for Northern Hemisphere people, it's going to be like the summer of Venus retrograde. And for Southern Hemisphere people, it's going to be the winter of Venus retrograde. And it may be that these processes of reflection, of, wandering or exploring, that 40-day period of Venus retrograde can be really significant. One thing you may or may not know is that Venus is retrograde in only 5 zodiac signs. So over the course of our lifetime, Venus will not go retrograde in every sign in the zodiac. And so that's really interesting to keep in mind when we're looking at using Venus retrograde from a timing perspective. Venus will retrograde in the same sign, one of those 5 signs. She comes back every 8 years. So in 2023, we're having Venus retrograde in Leo. That means 8 years prior, which will be the middle of 2015, that was the last time we had Venus retrograde in Leo. And so when you're working with clients around Venus retrograde cycles, you can talk about current circumstances and events, but you can also link it to events and circumstances from 8 years prior. So when we're talking about Venus retrograde with clients, we want to think about, what house will Venus be retrograde in? What might that signify for this reviewing one's relationship with pleasure or leisure or connection about that part of their chart, and how that links to themes and experiences from 8 years ago. But we also want to make it clear that this is going to be a repeating cycle every 8 years throughout the course of our life. When we're talking about Venus retrograde, we also want to bring in how that might affect our experiences around the Taurus and Libra parts of our chart. So that's another piece to have a little think about. The Venus retrograde might be in Leo, but it might indicate that review or that slow down or that go back over around topics to do with the Taurus part of your chart or the Libra part of your chart. And the great thing about the Venus Leo retrograde in 2023 is that from Leo, Venus aspects or can see both of the signs that she rules. So Venus in retro in Leo will square Taurus and will sextile Libra. Here's a visual diagram that shows approximately the places where when Venus is retrograde and makes her conjunction with the sun, which is the beginning of the 19-month Venus cycle, the approximate places where that's happening. And this is kind of a clue, or this is sort of pointing to the 5 signs that Venus will retrograde in. So currently she's retrograding in Aries, in Scorpio, in Gemini, in Leo, and in Capricorn. Now, there is a little bit of slippage. So, the Venus retrograde in Leo now versus the Venus retrograde in Leo 8 years ago, the degrees of the station retrograde and station direct, they slip by just a couple of degrees every 8 years. So that if you looked at where Venus was retrograde 100 years ago or 150 years ago, they would be in slightly different signs around. And I think this is really interesting if you want to reflect on generational indicators, because for the most part, through the course of a human lifespan, we just see Venus retrograde in these 5 signs. But people living 150 years ago had Venus retrograding in slightly different signs. And that may be a commentary on some of the social or collective experiences. So these are just little seeds of food for thought for your reflection and your own research projects going forward. Venus spends about that 6 weeks, 40 days to 42 days retrograde. And we know that in the progressed chart, that's going to translate to 40 to 42 years that progressed Venus is retrograde. And so, if you do live through your Venus going retrograde by progression, it's something that could be almost half your life, depending on where in that Venus retrograde cycle you might have been born. And then this diagram might be a little helpful. This diagram and the following diagram actually has the dates. And this is when Venus retrograde conjuncts the sun. So that inferior conjunction, which is the beginning of the 19-month Venus cycle. These are the dates and the degrees that happens. So you can see in 2023, the Venus retrograde sun conjunction is at 20 degrees of Leo on August 13. You can see that 8 years prior, it was on August 15 at 22 Leo. So that's that 2-degree kind of slippage that I'm referring to. So this first diagram is like current and past Venus retrograde cycles, which can be helpful as a resource tool. And this next diagram is like current and future. So the, 2023, the one prior was 2015, and the next one coming up after 2023 will be 2031. So that, some of you might really enjoy those resources. And, thinking about Venus, I'm like, this is such a useful piece to have. As I said, Venus retrograde, Mars retrograde, it's not something that I think you have to talk about with every client when you're doing a timing session, but there are some charts where they're going to be really charged or activated by the Venus retrograde or the Mars retrograde, or they're very heavy on, Venus ruled chart or Mars ruled chart, which will make it something that is definitely worthwhile talking about. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed that 8-minute mini Venus retrograde masterclass. If you're interested to keep up to date with all of the details about Venus retrograde and more, I hope you'll consider joining my monthly astrology guide. Here I share all kinds of tips and timing insights to help you time your life with astrology. It's where I share my most up-to-date info on what's happening this week and this month in the skies astrologically. And the existing members love both the community feel, but also how the info and insights is helping them both time their life with astrology and get better at understanding how astrology works. So if you'd like to join us, I'm going to pop the link below, and I hope to see you inside the membership soon. Bye for now.